My name is Dana. I am from Chicago, and after recently subscribing to your channel, I noticed that you accept story submissions from viewers. I do not have any stories for you per se, and thank God for that too. But I think you might be interested in the story of my late grandma, Ruth. It is not one she told often, but I remember it just about word for word. And with the help of my mom to fill in the blanks, I would like to share it with you. She was born in a place called Sopotkin, in what was then Poland, but is now part of Belarus. There were around 1,300 people living there when she was a child, and Sopotkin was a village where most of the nearly 250 families there were Jewish. Ruth used to wake up to the sound of cows being led out to pasture, as most families kept a milk cow in their barns. She and her family named their cow Nuri, after the Yiddish word for buttercup, and would feed her straw or potatoes that they grew in their cellar. Her father was a tailor, stitching coats and pants in his tiny workshop, while most others did physical labor or traded grain and cattle. Her dad did okay money-wise, but she said that money was always tight. The Polish government slapped heavy taxes on them and banned them from owning land, meaning that they had to pay rent every month instead of owning their homes outright. But even so, the villagers found ways to take care of each other. The rabbi's wife used to organize what they would call matan baset, which involved secretly donating food or other goods to needy families to ensure nobody went cold or hungry. And there was also a volunteer group called the Lenos Hatk, which was kind of like the Red Cross in that they went to homes of the sick to take care of them so their families would not lose out on work. Grandma Ruth said that life was hard, but holidays brought the town together like you would not believe. For Passover, families grouped up to bake matzahs in big communal ovens, kneading dough till their arms burned, but laughing all the while. And then, during other holidays, people would build bonfires in the fields and celebrate with songs and stories. But the joy did not last, because when Germany invaded Poland, when Ruth was still just a little girl, all of Sopotkin was terrified because, well, they might have been in the far east of Poland and thus far from the fighting. They knew what the Germans would do if they got their hands on them. Warsaw was under siege. The Polish army was in full retreat, and all hope seemed lost. But then the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east. It turns out that Russia had made a secret pact with Germany to carve up Poland. But since they kept Sopotkin far from the German clutches, Grandma Ruth said the invading Russians were treated like liberators. Anybody seemed better than the Germans, and at first the Soviets treated them just fine. But over the next period, things began to change. The Russians began kicking certain families out of their homes for arbitrary reasons. After that, they shut the stores down and herded craftsmen like my great-grandfather into compulsory collectives. The old wooden synagogue got turned into a movie house, and then the secret police started going around questioning and arresting people. Life became a new kind of hard, but it was nothing on what was to follow. Because in the summer, when Germany broke their secret peace pact with the Soviets and launched a surprise attack aimed at Russia's heartland, Grandma Ruth's home village of Sopotkin was very close to the new German-Soviet border, meaning that when that surprise attack launched, they were some of the first to feel it. The Russians stationed there would tell them how the Germans would not dare invade the mighty Soviet Union, not least because they were too busy dealing with a still defiant British. But then, at night, the Germans launched their attack. Their artillery began pummeling Sapotkin, setting houses, barns, and the old synagogue on fire while killing dozens and dozens of people. And by morning, the artillery had stopped. But as the villagers were putting out fires and retrieving the bodies of their loved ones, German soldiers advanced on the village and began rounding up the survivors. Grandma Ruth remembered how they forced all the villagers, women and children included, to dig a huge mass grave in the fields outside of town. Their hands were blistered and bleeding by the time that they were ordered to stop, and when they asked for food and water, the Germans refused them. Instead, they ordered the people of Sapotkin to drag their departed loved ones from the ruins of their village before unceremoniously dumping them into the huge earthen pit. Grandma said it was truly horrifying, and at one point, she saw a neighbor carrying what was left of his wife toward the pit. She was in pieces, and so was he. And yet, the young German soldier who shepherded him showed him no pity at all. He kept yelling, "Schnell! Schnell!" over and over, which I think meant hurry in their language. But it was as if the grieving man could not even hear him. He just kept walking toward the pit, carrying his wife's remains, whispering prayers for the dead under his breath. Grandma Ruth always said that they might have survived had the Germans not made the fateful discovery that more than 2/3 of the village were Jewish. But once they did, all hell broke loose. The German commander had the villagers rounded up again, and then he told them, "Poles, step to the right, Jews to the left." People only realized what was happening when the Germans began marching the town's Jews back toward the mass grave. Villagers began to break from the column, yelling out, "Run for your lives," only to be shot dead by German soldiers. A few brave men rushed the captors and attempted to overpower them, but there were too many Germans and too many guns. Yet their sacrifice and the chaos that unfolded afterward allowed a handful of villagers to slip into the nearby forests, and one of them was my Grandma Ruth, and she ran as far and as fast as her little legs could carry her, each step taking her deeper and deeper into the woods. My great-grandmother had told her to run, and in her naivety, Ruth believed that she would come running after her. But when she finally stopped to look around, panting and shaking from the ceaseless exertion, her mother was nowhere to be seen. She cried out, hoping my great-grandma was just out of sight. But not only was Ruth alone, she had no idea where she was. The only thing she did know is that she could not go home. And so instead, she carried on walking in the opposite direction, hoping that she might find safety before the Germans found her. She said she walked for hours and hours, stopping only to drink from the canal before she swam across one of its narrower points. That would have killed her had it been winter, but the warm summer evening kept her from shivering, and her clothes were almost dry again by nightfall. Ruth tried to keep going, but before long it was so dark that she could barely make out the ground in front of her. She knew that she had to find a place to stop and rest for the night. But just as she was about to stop and curl up on the forest floor where she was, she spotted the glow of a campfire through some distant trees. Grandma Ruth kept on creeping through the woods, getting closer and closer to the fire, when she suddenly saw a big makeshift shelter made of mud, leaves, and some dead wood. Over the fire was a huge cauldron of something which boiled and bubbled, and it was only when she got closer that she realized that hanging from branches all around were the bodies of skinned and headless animals. Grandma Ruth said that she was terrified and believed that she had come across the home of some witch. Then, when some old hunchbacked woman came staggering out from under the blanket which served as the shelter's door, her worst fears were confirmed. The woman had patchy gray hair, a hooked nose, and small, beady eyes, which locked on her in an instant. Grandma Ruth remembered a crooked smile stretching that woman's lips, revealing a mouth of blackened, decaying teeth, and then she ran, exhausted, but renewed with terror, as this old woman called after her through the darkness. "Little girl, come back here at once," she cried, trying to sound motherly at first. But Grandma Ruth soon heard the woman lose her temper as she screeched out, "I will find you. Just you wait and see." Grandma Ruth said that she could remember that feeling of terror. She had just lost her family and then found herself being hunted by some forest witch. But looking back on it, that was obviously not what happened. That woman was no doubt a local villager, one who had been kicked out of her home by the Russian occupiers, and many such people took to living in the forest, preferring a life in the wild to one in a Soviet labor camp in the country's far east. The woman no doubt wanted to help my Grandma Ruth, but in her traumatized and exhausted state, she assumed the worst and went running off into the forest again. She said it was awful, that she tripped and fell and hurt herself many times. But driven near mad with horror, she could not stop herself. She grazed her knees, tore up her elbows, even bashed her head on the root of a tree so hard that she felt blood oozing from her hairline. But she only stopped when she was sure that she was safe. And after curling up among the crook of some tree stump, she soon fell asleep. Grandma Ruth said the nightmares woke her up before dawn. She was screaming in her dreams, and then she was screaming when she woke up too. And since she was frightened that someone might have heard her, she was soon on the move again. She walked for hours again, feeling her stomach starting to rumble, but not daring to touch any of the many mushrooms and fungi which sprouted from the earth around her. Yet the longer she walked with no food or water, the more she weakened, and she knew that it would not be long before she could no longer walk at all. So imagine her joy when she found a wide dirt path snaking through the trees, because this, no doubt, led to a settlement, and a settlement meant salvation. Grandma said that she felt a sense of hope for the first time as she followed the track through the woods, a sense of hope which only doubled when she heard the sound of an engine heading down the track toward her. Since it was coming from the direction she was traveling, Grandma assumed it was a truck full of Russian soldiers headed to the front lines. But when it came into view, her heart jumped into her throat. Because it was not the green of a Russian military truck, the truck was a distinctly German gray. Grandma Ruth rushed off the track and into the trees, knowing that the truck's driver must have spotted her. She could run and risk being shot by any soldiers in its rear, or she could gamble her life on a hiding place. I am not sure how she managed to hold her nerve and select a suitable hiding place in what must have been mere seconds of deliberation. But that is what she did. And by some stroke of luck, she found a hollowed-out log large enough to hide herself in. Ruth crawled inside. The interior was wet with slime and wriggling with bugs, and they skittered across her skin, nestling in her hair. But she had to stay quiet and did not move. She said it was only moments later that she heard the truck come to a stop. Its engine cut off, and then a voice cut through the silence, yelling something sharp and short in German. Grandma then heard soldiers piling out of the back, and after another yell, she heard their footsteps getting louder and louder and louder. They were searching for her, and she said one of them was no further than 15 feet away at one point, when a shrill and sudden shriek grabbed their attention. The girl had a distinctly local dialect, not Yiddish or Polish, but Belarusian, and she was yelling out things like, "Haven't you got enough? Leave her alone. You Germans are animals. Nothing but animals." The Germans just laughed at first, and I came to realize that there were several other prisoners, all women and girls from the sounds of things, and I heard one beg the shouting girl to be quiet and not to make trouble. But she did not listen. The German suddenly went from laughing to shouting, and then one of them cried out in pain. I think one of the prisoners must have scratched or bitten him, most likely the one that was yelling. But after she cried out, it went from calm to chaos. She thinks the girl who hurt the German soldiers tried to escape from the back of the truck, because Grandma Ruth heard much faster footsteps moving away from them as the soldiers rushed to control their captives. She said that there was a lot of yelling and screaming, and that for every angry male German voice, there was a Russian or Polish one, much higher in lilt, that sounded scared to death. Something terrible was happening, but Grandma could see none of it. And then suddenly, there was a gunshot so loud that it made her jump. And then, while the Germans were silenced, their female captives became hysterical. Grandma said one of the Germans yelled, "Schnell," which I am sure needs no translation here. And then he began to berate another much younger sounding soldier, presumably for shooting one of their captives. Grandma said that she had assumed that they had resumed their search, but instead their commander ordered them back into the truck, and they kept on down the track until Grandma could no longer hear them. Only when a deep and terrible silence had returned to the forest did Grandma emerge from her filthy, grimy hiding place. She made her way back to the track, creeping through the trees until it came into view. And when it did, she saw the body of a young woman lying dead in the dirt. She was face up, staring up at the sky with these wide, terrified eyes, like she had been frightened to death. Grandma Ruth said that she had stopped and stared for a moment, overcome by the horror and senselessness of it all. And then she turned and kept on walking, and she only took a few steps along the open track before she decided it was a bad idea. If one German truck had been driving along, why not another? And so she skipped back into the trees again, into the deep, dark woods where she could hide. She hoped that by wandering through the woods, she might find the villages of Kadesh or Kitty. But the woods outside of Sapotkin are vast, and she once again found herself walking miles and miles without so much of a trace of civilization. She walked and walked, feeling herself becoming more and more parched and hungry, until finally she began to feel sick and lightheaded. She staggered along, wondering how much longer she would be able to continue, until suddenly she heard the sound of something shrill creeping through the trees. It was music, a violin to be specific. And then, after hunting down its source, she found a small Russian encampment, along with a wounded soldier sitting on an ammunition tin. She stopped leaning against a tree and watched him make that violin sing a sad old Russian song. And then, once he was done, he looked around and saw her, but she did not startle him. Grandma did not speak Russian, only Yiddish and a little Polish, but she could understand enough to know that the man was inviting her to come and have a seat. He gave her water and some bread, and then, as she ate, Grandma noticed the bloody bandages around his abdomen and how pale and gaunt the man looked. When he talked, she barely understood a word of what he said, but it was clear that he was dying, and that in his final hours, he only wished to play his violin. When my Ruth was finished eating, the man pointed off into the trees. Grandma understood soldiers, bread, and water, and that is all she needed to hear. When Grandma Ruth thanked the wounded soldier, he smiled. And then, as she walked away, he began playing the same sorrowful tune that she had heard on her approach. And then, she walked and walked till she could hear it no more. Grandma Ruth said that by that point, her feet and legs were aching from what felt like endless walking and running. But having eaten and drunk her fill, and knowing her salvation lay on the other side of the forest, she found both the strength and will to keep going. She kept on pushing through the woods, praying that she would find safety before she had to spend another night in the woods, until suddenly there was a loud whizzing as something flew past her head, before the sound was immediately followed by the loud crack of a rifle being fired. Grandma Ruth said that she darted behind a tree, convinced she had run into a German patrol. And then, when another bullet struck the tree that she was hiding behind so hard that it made the whole thing shake, she started to scream. Ruth said that she unleashed all of her pain and grief and terror and exhaustion with those screams. There were no words, just wild shrieks as yet more bullets struck the tree that she was hiding behind. Then, suddenly, the firing stopped. Grandma said that in the moments that followed, she believed that she would be overcome by German soldiers. They would swarm her, beat her, and she did not know this at the time, but she would be lucky if she was merely killed, as the fate that awaited her in a German slave labor camp would be 1,000 times worse than simply a quick death. But no sooner had the shooting stopped, she heard a voice yelling out, "It is just a girl! It is just a little girl!" A man was yelling in Polish, chastising another for shooting at her. And then the next thing, the voice is calling out to her, telling her to come out, that they are friendly and they wanted to take care of her. Grandma said that she believed it was a trick and could only bring herself to peek around the tree that she was hiding behind. But there, walking toward her through the trees, were a group of Polish and Belarusian partisans, civilian fighters wearing civilian clothes. By nightfall, Grandma Ruth was in a mixed encampment of partisans and Soviet soldiers. All had been taken completely by surprise by the German attack, so the scene was a chaotic one. But once again, she was thankfully given food and water by the soldiers before accompanying various groups of Russian soldiers as they retreated back to Moscow to mount a final valiant defense on their nation's capital. There she lived in a home for orphan children, and it was there that she heard of the war's progression. Everybody seemed to think that they were doomed when she first arrived. Yet slowly but surely, fortunes were reversed. First, the Germans failed to complete their pincer movement by which they intended to encircle Moscow. And after that, the Russian counterattack started, and each one seemed to be a resounding success. The first real celebration came when it was announced that the Germans had officially been driven out of Russian territory. And then, the next big celebration came when the first Soviet soldiers stepped foot on sovereign German territory. The war they started had returned to their homeland, something which brought the entire world a great amount of joy. Yet that joy paled in comparison to which was felt when the greatest news of the 20th century hit the airwaves. The leader of Germany and commander-in-chief of their great and powerful armed forces was dead. You know his name. No one really believed it at first, as it was very hard to distinguish between real news and that which was merely propaganda. People had to wait to have headlines confirmed by friends or relatives who had seen evidence of such things with their own eyes. Obviously, the Allies were unable to recover the remains of their leader, and to this day, this gives rise to theories that he really did not die and somehow escaped. Some accepted the news, and others took it with a grain of salt, but not a single person could contain their jubilation when news came that the Germans had surrendered. The Russians kept much of the territory that they had taken from the Germans, including the eastern portion of Berlin. And then, when she was still just a young woman, my grandma Ruth was sent from Moscow to Poland as part of a work program, and there she met an American journalist of Polish origin, and the two conversed in Polish as they worked on and documented the rebuilding of Warsaw. They fell in love, got married, and Ruth moved to America with him once his assignment was over. She later found out that she had been declared a traitor by the Soviets, as technically she abandoned her post before her work assignment was finished. But Grandma did not care. She had no intention of ever returning to Europe, even when the wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own bureaucracy. She said the memories were all too powerful, and that traveling through the continent would be like traveling through a giant cemetery in which she had no idea where her family was buried, or if they were even buried at all. She knew where the mass grave was. She could never forget. But as they began to lose the war, the Germans often dug up the mass graves containing the bodies of those they had slaughtered and burned them in a giant pile to conceal evidence of their crimes. There would be no guarantee my ancestors' bodies would even still be there. And even so, it did not matter. Grandma Ruth carried her memories of them in her heart from place to place, and they were only extinguished on the day she died. In that way, her heart became a cemetery, all of its own, a living, beating memorial to the loved ones she had lost. A part of preserving that memory was passing on the story first to her daughter and then to me. So, here is to you, Grandma Ruth, and your incredible story of resilience and survival. You may well have a grave here in America, but just as you did, I will carry all my happy memories of you in my heart, where they can never be dug up, burned, or erased. Many years ago now, at a Thanksgiving get-together, me and my cousin were talking about old Kevin Costner movies, this one specifically called The Postman. Now, for those who have not seen it, it is pretty simple. Society goes to crap, anarchy reigns, but then Kevin Costner rekindles civilization by restarting the Federal Post Service. As me and my cousin were watching it, we started discussing how unrealistic it all seemed. But what we did not know was that our old great-uncle had woken up from his nap and was actually listening to our conversation. Now, I think I said something about movies lacking authenticity and not being believable, and then kind of jumped as our great-uncle Ray piped up and said, "There are much stranger stories than that have never been put to film. I will tell you that for nothing." Now, me and my cousin asked, "Like what, Uncle Ray?" To which he replied, Like, what about a story about a town called Story and the Wolfman living out near Murder Creek? My cousin and I waved him off, saying that there was no such story about a town called Story, and no such place called Murder Creek. But Uncle Ray swore blind that it was true. And he even said that he met the Wolfman, and that he was covered in hair and had these big yellow eyes, and that he was as real as you or me. When me and my cousin responded, "Swear on the Bible, Uncle Ray," he told us he would swear on anything we wanted him to. And then, in exchange for grabbing him another beer from the fridge, this is the story he told us. Our Uncle Ray was born in a little Arkansas town called Mount Ida, back when it was the largest town in Montgomery County. But there were only a couple of hundred people living there at the time that the story actually took place. The rest were spread out among little hamlets, named things like Malden, Gibbs, Washita, and Story. Now, back then, Story was nothing more than a couple of houses and a site that they had marked out to build a Baptist church. But just like today, it is almost entirely surrounded by dense pine woods as it resides on the western edges of the National Forest. Uncle Ray went to high school with a girl who lived up in Story named Emily Barlow. She was a pretty young lady with light blonde hair and big blue eyes, and all the boys at school had a crush on her. But then one day, a young Emily walked off into the woods to find a toy arrow her little brother had lost. But she did not walk out again. She was found a few hours later by her distraught father and uncle, and what they saw horrified them. Emily Barlow had been beaten to a pulp and stripped of her clothes, and when they found her, she was clinging to life. A doctor was summoned, who arrived at the Barlow residence as quickly as he could, and then, after stemming the girl's internal bleeding and administering a cutting-edge treatment known as a blood transfusion. At the time, Emily's father was told the girl might just live. Thankfully, Emily Barlow did end up surviving her ordeal, but was unable to describe her attacker until she was properly rested. And yet, when she did, the blood of those who heard her description ran cold. Because according to young Emily, the thing that attacked her was no man, but a monster. Emily said she had been walking through the woods, eyes on the ground, in search of her brother's toy arrow. He had been crying about losing it for almost an hour. So rather than listen to him wailing on about it for any longer, she took it upon herself to find it for him. And yet, as she walked through the pines, determined to stop her brother's crying, something jumped out from behind a tree and struck her so hard in the side of the head that she blacked out for a moment. She woke up on the ground with something on top of her, something which appeared to sport jet-black hair all over its body. It drooled as it let out a guttural growl, savaging her on the forest floor. And then, as she tried to resist, it began striking her again. The next thing she remembered, it howled before it rolled away from her and found its feet. She thought the ordeal was over, and that the creature believed that she was dead, until suddenly it lunged at her and began hitting her around the head and neck until she blacked out again. She later said that she believed that she was in heaven when her father and uncle first woke her up, and then when she realized she was not, the pain was so great that all she wanted to do was die. But then, once she recovered, the only thing which frightened her more than that thought was the image of that monster writhing and howling on top of her. One of the men in attendance, when Emily described her attacker, was the county sheriff, and he soon organized a search of the woods around Story, a search which included not only deputies, but also a whole bunch of volunteers armed with shotguns and rifles. But on account of just how nervous and twitchy everyone was, it took just about all the deputies' organizational skills just to keep the volunteers from shooting one another. Needless to say, the hunt for Emily Barlow's attacker was unsuccessful. And the same could be said for the second hunt, which was mounted that very next day. But in the early morning hours of the third day, a deputy named Harlan got up before dawn, put on his uniform and a blaze orange hunting cap, and then went walking off into the woods with a rifle slung over his shoulder. According to my great-uncle Ray, Deputy Harlan was half Choctaw on his father's side, and that his daddy had taught him all kinds of hunting and tracking skills as a boy. The county sheriff had not wanted to let him off the leash, as it were, on account of all the volunteers. But on that third day, and tired of a bunch of clumsy but well-meaning hunters slowing him down, Deputy Harlan walked off into the woods to bag himself a monster. He started right back at the place the attack happened, and then from there, he wandered deeper and deeper into the woods until he reached a stream out near a hill they call Calibri Mountain. It was just after dawn had broken, so there was a soft, blue light breaking through the trees. And then, as Deputy Harlan was walking by the river's edge, smack bang, in the middle of nowhere, he looked up to see something which stopped him in his tracks. Downstream from him by maybe 50 or 60 yards, a man was kneeling by the water's edge and drinking from the stream. Only, it could not have been a man. The thing was dressed and would look like rags and was covered in that same thick, dark hair that Emily Barlow had described. Dark fur covered its exposed arms and shoulders and ran all the way down to his legs before stopping at filthy black pads on the soles of its feet. Harlan stared in disbelief at this creature, as unaware of his presence. It continued to drink. Then finally, Harlan suddenly snapped out of his stupor and brought his rifle to his shoulder. Yet, after hearing the distinct chambering of a round of Harlan's rifle, the creature looked up, saw him, then bolted off into the trees on two legs at speeds that seemed impossibly fast. Harlan later said that he was too shaken to even attempt to shoot, not just because of how shaken he was, but because whatever that thing was, it needed to be brought in alive. Even as far back as then, people believed in Sasquatches and mountain men. Deputy Harlan was a practical man and did not believe that there was a single animal out there that he had not seen during one of his hunts in the woods. So, imagine his shock and surprise when he saw what he believed was some kind of missing link right there before his eyes. He told the county sheriff what he saw the moment he got back to Mount Ida, and when he did, the sheriff went about organizing a third search to be conducted that very next day. Only instead of combing the woods through the morning and the afternoon, the deputies and just a handful of the best hunters would set up hides near bodies of water where they would watch and wait for any sign of this strange creature. Unfortunately, the attempt to catch it unawares again was unsuccessful, but that just made it clear that they were dealing with a highly intelligent and therefore highly dangerous predator. But Deputy Harlan was not ready to give up yet. After their unsuccessful stakeout, he stayed in the woods and made his way back toward Calibri Mountain, where he had first studied the strange beast. He walked for miles and miles, zigzagging through the woods, searching for any and all traces of it, and he even had to spend a night in the forest to cover all the ground he wanted. He said, being huddled around the campfire, knowing that thing was out there in the darkness, it was the most scared he had ever been in his life, but he made it through the night all the same. And at dawn, he kept on searching for that thing that attacked Emily Barlow. Deputy Harlan kept on creeping through the trees, knowing that he could be just seconds away from running into that thing again, since it seemed to be active around dawn. And then, right as he started to get within a mile or two of Murder Creek, which actually is a real place, we even looked it up, he started seeing all kinds of animal carcasses, all of which appeared to have been stripped of their meat. And when he found tufts of that thick black hair around some of the skeletal remains, Deputy Harlan knew that he must be close. But as he got closer and closer to Murder Creek, he could have never prepared himself for what he was about to discover. Because as he crept along the side of the hill, he spotted a small cave. It was no more than a flat, triangular tunnel. But right there, feasting on the raw meat of some small, furry animal, was the creature he had spotted just days prior. Deputy Harlan raised his rifle, aiming it at the creature and trapping it inside of its own shallow den. But as it looked up and locked eyes with the deputy, he realized it was no wild beast, because despite the thick black hair covering the thing's body, its eyes were distinctly human. The thing held Deputy Harlan's gaze as it dropped what it was eating, but it did not try to escape. Instead, it began to shake its head in a voice that sounded like it had only the slightest grasp of English as it pleaded, "No." Deputy Harlan was so stunned that he thought he might fall down, but as he continued to stare, aghast and open-mouthed, he realized the thing was not a thing at all, but rather a man, a young man, and one with a very peculiar affliction. Since Deputy Harlan had already resigned himself to wandering the woods after that previous morning stakeout, he was carrying some hard cheese and bacon wrapped in a little cloth. He took it out and offered some to the strange young man, who gobbled it down greedily as soon as it was offered. And then, over the next few hours or so, he gained the young man's trust and began to learn a thing or two about him. It was not clear exactly how it happened, but Deputy Harlan realized that while the young man must have been abandoned as a child, fear and suspicion had led him to a life in the wild. He spent his formative years in the small town of Back in Montgomery County. But whenever people saw him, they got scared. And when they got scared, they got violent. The man had become all too accustomed to fleeing at the sight of them. And even when Deputy Harlan felt he had earned his trust, the young man would still flinch whenever he spoke too loud or moved too fast. As night drew in, Deputy Harlan made a campfire just a few feet away from the young man's den. Now, it must have been the first time that he had seen a fire up close in decades, because while he was not strictly scared of it, the process of its creation fascinated him. And then, while demonstrating a much stronger ability to comprehend rather than speak, Deputy Harlan spent that night convincing the strange young man to follow him back into town that next morning, not only to begin his reintegration into society, but to prove that he could not have been the one to attack young Emily Barlow. But then, right around the same time Harlan was earning the man's trust, something terrible was unfolding back in a tiny Montgomery County hamlet known as Sims. That afternoon, a homemaker by the name of Carol McCormick was putting away some of her husband's laundry. Prohibition had ended not just a couple of years before, and her husband Robert liked to enjoy a few drinks with his buddies after work without having to worry about the sheriff showing up to throw him in jail. And this meant that he would not be back till after dark. But this also meant that when she found a small silver heart necklace tucked into the back of his sock drawer with a name May engraved onto it, she had hours and hours to wallow in grief and anger before Bob finally came home. Carol was convinced her husband was having an affair. It had been months since he touched her. He was heading out at odd times to do things he did not want to talk about. And even worse, he had been forgetting to pick up her crocheting supplies from the Mount Ida General Store. And so when he staggered through the door sometime around then, stinking of whiskey and cigarettes, Carol McCormick demanded to know who in the hell this May lady was. Her husband, unprepared for such an ambush, could not provide an answer to her question. And while Carol rather correctly interpreted this as a sign of Bob's guilt, he was not guilty of that which she accused him of. And when everything went down, when Carol suddenly realized who May was and who the necklace really belonged to, she ran screaming from the house and out into the night. Carol had remembered hearing something about how, while all of Emily Barlow's torn clothes were found around her body, one thing was missing from the scene: a necklace given to Emily by her sister, but one that had originally been a gift to her. And the name of Emily's older sister was Mabel Juliet Barlow, more commonly referred to as May. Carol knew most of that. Everyone knew everyone in Montgomery County back then. She just could not bring herself to entertain the possibility till she saw that look in her husband's eyes. But Bob did not just let her go that night. Oh no, he could not. He could not have his good lady wife going around telling tales and ruining his good reputation over what he considered to be a drunken mistake. And so he followed her outside into the night and tried bashing her head in with a shovel. Carol's screams were the only thing that saved her life. That and the shotgun one of their neighbors held when he came out to see what in the hell was going on out there. He told Bob if he so much as moved, he would blow his goddamn head off. And then his wife came out to join him. And after gasping at the sight of her husband holding their beloved Bob at gunpoint, she grabbed the rope that he used to tie Bob up, and he was off in the direction of Mount Ida to grab the sheriff. Uncle Ray said Bob McCormick spent the night in the county jail and did so on 2 charges of attempted murder, among other things. The next morning, a still weak Emily was brought to his cell and asked if that was the man who attacked her. She did not have to say yes, because when she erupted into screams and cries, stumbling into the arms of her father to cry and cry and cry, it was all the confirmation anyone needed. And then, by pure happenstance, right around the time Emily Barlow was led away from the county jail, Deputy Harlan walked back into town with that young man following close behind. Harlan had told him not to be scared, and that any sour reactions from the Mount Ida citizenry would be met with a brief but all-encompassing explanation. The man was no monster. He had an illness. He had been neglected, and it was time to start making things right for him. While Bob McCormick had to await the date of his trial in the county jail, the young man stayed with Deputy Harlan, along with his wife and young son. He was taught to live like a person again, how to wash and dress himself, and how to eat at a table using knives and forks. It was not an overnight transformation. It took time, and as he learned to speak again, the young man took the name Elias. Another reason my great-uncle Ray remembered the tale so well. He took the name after Mrs. Harlan's Bible study sessions helped him learn to read, and saying he was inspired to do so by Elias's story. Elias was a man betrayed by his family, one who was sold into slavery and became a prisoner in a foreign land. Elias eventually forgave his family and reportedly told them in the scripture, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." And by the time Bob McCormack was being sentenced to years of hard labor, Deputy Harlan was trying to find young Elias a job. Given how skittish he was, as well as his lack of general education, Elias was far too anxious and frightened for regular employment. But Deputy Harlan did not give up on him. And after hearing of a freak show that was attached to a traveling carnival, he paid the show a visit when it passed through Montgomery County. But rather than find a cruel and exploitative operation that took advantage of the so-called freaks in its employment, Deputy Harlan found a sanctuary for such people. There was a bearded lady named Leela, a tiny little dwarf man who danced the Lindy Hop, and a fellow who called himself the Lizard Man, but who in reality just had some kind of skin condition. These people welcomed Elias with open arms, telling them that he was finally in a place where folk understood and did not judge. And then, since he was born and raised in a little town just down the road from Story, young Elias's stage name had just about been decided for him. For backstage, he would be Elias, their compatriot and co-worker. But to the audience, he would be the weird and wonderful Wolfman, and they would be charged money for the honor of seeing and talking to him. Word has it that Deputy Harlan cried a few silent tears on the day that the carnival left town, not out of sadness, but because of the way Elias had thanked him for saving his life. And then after that, the story of Emily Barlow, Deputy Harlan, and the Wolfman passed on into legend and became a tale passed down from one generation to another. Like I said, my cousin and I went away and did our own research because we did not think that there was a single chance in hell that a town called Story and a creek called Murder were real places. And like I may have also said, every single piece that Uncle Ray mentioned checked out. And so, to me, the story of the Wolfman is all the proof I needed that sometimes the truth is far, far stranger than fiction could ever be. My name is Irina. I recently became a subscriber of yours, and I think I have a story from my younger years that you might be interested in. I currently live in London with my husband and my grown-up daughter, but I grew up in Russia during the Soviet times, and in the summer, when I was a 26-year-old junior researcher at the Leningrad Institute of Geology. My work was, in a word, boring. But back then, working at a university allowed you certain privileges, such as the opportunity for travel. So when I was offered a spot on a research trip set to Siberia, I jumped at the chance. Myself and a team of 7 other researchers flew from Moscow to Irkutsk, then to Krasnoyarsk. Then from there, a much smaller plane would fly us out to a town on the banks of the Yenisei River named Zotino, where we would study nearby coal deposits. The plane was an old Antonov, the smaller propeller-driven kind that smelled of oil and was horribly uncomfortable to sit in. We sat on the metal benches holding our sample bags on our laps shouting to be heard over the planes rattling. But then, a couple of hours into the flight, the engines start coughing. First one, then the other. The pilot came on the intercom and said it was nothing to worry about. But only a minute later, the plane dropped hard. People screamed, and I remember gripping the metal bench so hard that the edge bit into my fingers. The sound of rushing air got louder and louder until it sounded like it was screaming. Tree branches came rushing up at us through the windows before a sudden impact threw all of us forward. The glass smashed and metal groaned. And then the next thing I remember, I was waking up in the wreck to this horrible silence hanging in the air. My head hurt and my knee was in agony, but I could just about stand. The pilot and co-pilot were still in their seats, but they had not made it. The rest of us were alive, but in bad shape. Victor had a broken leg. Nadia's arm was so badly broken that she could not stop crying, while the others had an assortment of broken legs and twisted ankles, along with cuts, bruises, and a few cracked ribs. The plane's radio was broken, so there was no calling for help. Nobody could walk far, and I was the only one on my feet, and so it only made sense that it was me who went to look for help. We had some supplies that survived the crash. It was little more than 2 plastic bottles of water from the cockpit and 3 small bags of peanuts that the steward had handed out before takeoff. I knew I could make them all last quite a while, but we were in one of the largest uninterrupted forests in the world. It stretched in every direction, thick, dark, and endless, and we did not have even the faintest of idea of where we were. There was a flare gun, but we had to wait until the sun had set for that to be truly effective. And until then, what choice was there other than to make the most of what little energy I had? I stuffed the bottled water and peanuts into my coat pockets, listening as my injured comrades wished me luck, and then I started walking toward what I assumed was the east. The first day was the easiest. I followed what looked like a game trail, one that was infested with mosquitoes, which bit at my face and neck. And by the evening time, my knee was throbbing, and I had already drank more than half a bottle of water. I stopped where there was a shelter, ate a handful of peanuts, and then slept against a fallen log for a few hours until it got too cold to sleep. On the second day, the wolves found me. I heard them first, their low howls far off at first, but then they got closer. I saw their shapes between the trees, all gray and thin, and there had to be at least 6 or 7 of them, and they did not rush or charge me. They just followed at first, keeping 20 or 30 meters back. I picked up a branch and waved it, shouting at the top of my voice to seem big and scary. They stayed away, but they did not leave. That night, I made a small fire with dried twigs and pine needles. I sat with my back to the flames, watching for any sign of those wolves, and before long, I could see the flames glowing in their eyes. I took a stick from the fire and waved it around while shouting in hopes that it would scare them off. It did not. They just kept watching and waiting. And by the third day, my water was almost gone, and the peanuts were down to 1 bag. My lips were cracked from the dehydration, and every single step hurt like a fresh wound. The forest looked the same in every direction. Nothing but tall pines and fallen logs covering as far as the eye could see. I started talking to myself just to hear a voice, telling myself the others back at the wreck were still alive and that I was going to make it. The wolves were still there, getting closer the more I slowed. I kept the branch in my hand like a club, but I knew that if they came for me, I was done for. Late on the fourth afternoon, I smelled wood smoke from a campfire, and as far as I thought, I was imagining it like a kind of forest mirage or something. But then I heard the sound of loud saws, and I started walking faster. My heart was beating so hard, it felt like it was going to burst because I knew I had done it. And then, as the trees opened up a little, there it was, a small logging camp stretched out in front of me. There had to be 5 or 6 wooden huts, a big pile of cut logs, and a generator chugging away and belching out some black smoke. Men in padded jackets and felt boots moved between the buildings, but they did not seem to be Russian, and I soon discovered that they were actually Chinese migrant workers working under an international labor program. I had heard rumors that some contract workers came from China to cut timber in the Far East, but I never thought that I would ever see them up close. As I approached, one of them spotted me and shouted. They all stopped, and then a short man with a black cap came forward, and he spoke with a very heavy Russian accent, but I could understand him. He asked where I had come from and what had happened to me, and I told him that there was a plane crash, that others were hurt, and that they needed help. He did not ask many questions. He simply brought me inside to the nearest hut to warm me up. Someone gave me some hot tea with sugar, and then they fed me rice and some kind of salted fish. I told them about the wreck, about the wolves, about the peanuts I had left. And then when I thought about my comrades, I started to cry. The man with the black cap, his name was Lao, and he tried to comfort me and then promised that he would get help. There was a phone in the hut. Lao picked it up, spoke fast in some Chinese, and then waited a few moments before he switched to Russian. He said that there were survivors who needed rescue, and then began reading off a set of coordinates while looking at a map. The search team came the next morning in 2 helicopters. They asked if they knew which direction I traveled, and since I had a rough idea, they flew us west. It looked like a great ocean of trees out there, like it would be impossible to find the wreck and my comrades. But then suddenly, someone pointed and shouted, and there it was. It looked tiny from the air, just a crumpled metal shape in that ocean of green. My comrades were still alive, huddled under a shelter that they made out of a tarp thrown over the crash plane's wing. When they heard the helicopters, some of them hobbled out and began waving. There were no places to land, so the rescue workers had to haul my wounded comrades up on stretchers attached to ropes. I was in a helicopter with Victor and Nadia. They were too weak to talk, but they did not need to. No words could have been adequate to describe what we felt in that moment. They took us to a hospital far away, and doctors set bones, gave us shots, and fed us broth. And then, after a week of treatment and rest, they flew us back to Leningrad. We thought that they would be happy to see us, but when our colleagues from the institute met us at the airport, they looked nervous. And then when we got back to the institute, they told us the bad news. Thanks to our failure, the ministry had decided to cut our funding. That was how things worked back then. We were punished for things we had no control over, quite literally adding insult to injury. And I was back at work after about 6 weeks. And for a long time, my knee would ache whenever it rained. And sometimes at night, I would wake up sweating after nightmares about the wolves. I still have one empty peanut bag in a drawer at home. It is faded and torn, but it serves as a reminder of what I have lived through and achieved. We survived not just because one person could walk, but because others were kind, and because sometimes fate gives you a chance. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations as I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. I would love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All the links for everything are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if not friend, why friend-shaped?